Football is Round, a global history of football. Earlier this year, he published Injury Time, Football in a State of Emergency, and he is eminently qualified to give us a historical introduction to this discussion. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you. So, I'm not going to talk a lot about, if at all, about the current moment, but set it in a much longer history of political conflict through football in Israel and Palestine. And there are three moments that I really want to think about. The first is what happened in Mandate Palestine between 1970 after 1917. The process by which Israel, which began its football life as part of the Asian Football Confederation, came to be in UEFA, and thus playing an Israeli team will be playing Aston Villa. And thirdly, to think about Israel's behaviour with regard to football and Palestine in the 1990s and 2000s, and the case against Israel being in football at all at the moment. So to return to 1917, we don't have a lot of records of very much football in the region prior to 1917. Certainly the occupying Ottoman Turks were not great football players. Certainly in the army, football in Turkey was considered dangerously foreign by many and was confined for the most part to Istanbul and the Mediterranean coast. But from 1917 onwards, we do see a lot of football, and we see a lot of politicized football, and it dramatizes all of the different conflicts going on in the region. So the British Army, which is now the occupying power, is certainly playing a lot of football and has been playing football within its ranks for a long time. And we find also the emergence of many Jewish football teams, in part because so many Central European Jews are arriving in the region, and Central Europe has an incredible popular tradition of playing football. It would have been the norm for any young man of any ethnicity from Vienna or Prague or Budapest who came to Palestine in 1917. You would play football. So the first space in which football becomes politicized is actually amongst the Jewish migrants. And we find the formation of sports teams and sports organizations along the political lines of the separate Zionist organizations. So we have the Hapoels, who are connected to the left and the nascent trade union movement. We have teams that call themselves Maccabi, which is where Maccabi Tel Aviv of today is ultimately descended from, which are a more sort of centrist, liberal form of Zionism at the time. And then we have the Beitars, who are most definitely on the right, the more ultra-nationalist versions of Zionism. And they're all playing football against each other, and it's got a political edge, even in the 1920s. The second space in which football is politicised are the games being played by Jewish teams against the British Army. And the British Army, as you can imagine, and this is a story repeated in 100 colonial locations, the football pitch becomes a way of expressing resistance to what is perceived to be an illegitimate occupation. And we certainly have records of some, to use the contemporary vernacular, pretty tasty encounters between Zionists and the British Army. But we also begin to have records of Palestinian Arabs beginning to play football. And like everywhere in the world where excluded people see football being played, it's like, oh, I'd like to be doing some of that. That looks good. And that immediately takes on an inevitable political connotation. This is enhanced in the late 1920s, excuse me, and early 1930s, when the Palestinian Football Association is formed. And the Palestinian Football Association is pretty much an exclusively Jewish organization in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And an application is made to FIFA, to become part of the football world. And as again, with so many nationalist struggles, having a space in global football, having your nation on the pitch seems to be an essential element of the cultural politics of nationhood. And FIFA, to its credit, does go back to the Palestinian Football Association and say, are you going to be open to everyone? Are you open to Arabs? Are you open to Christians? And the reply comes, oh, yes, everybody is invited. And on that basis, a Palestinian team competes in the qualifying rounds of the 1934 and 1938 World Cups. And in actual fact, of course, the team is entirely Jewish and they're wearing Stars of David. Forgive me while I have bit of tea here.
Got
And
another 5 minutes, David.
as a consequence, we see resistance from Palestinian Arabs who attempt to form their own football association, who make their own applications to join FIFA. These, of course, are refused. This continues actually once the State of Israel is formed, and there are attempts again with support of Egypt and Jordan for a distinct Palestinian football association to be created. This is denied. So in the post-war era, there is just the Israel Football Association, which is now part of the Asian Football Confederation, as indeed, of course, its neighbours are Lebanon, Jordan, and so on. And in the 1970s, particularly in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, there is a number of states in Asia refused to play Israel, and eventually there becomes so many that there is a majority within the Asian Football Confederation, led by Kuwait, for expelling Israel from the Asian Football Confederation. And this happens, I think, in the mid 1980s. Israel then operates in a sort of weird no man's land in global football, where it competes as part of Oceania, hysterically, for World Cup qualification. And eventually UEFA accept Israel, the Israeli Football Federation, which, to my mind, as a kind of European colonial project, has a certain kind of justice that in the end Israel end up in UEFA. Um, this becomes much more politicized in the 1990s, and I think this, in a way, is the most important thing for today's discussion, is that the way in which Israeli football has operated for the last 20 or 30 years, the game between Aston Villa and Maccabi Tel Aviv should never have happened, because there is a very, very strong case for Israel being suspended from FIFA, suspended from UEFA, and suspended from international football. And this is irrespective of what has happened in Gaza and the politics of the last couple of years. We need not engage there to make a case against the Israeli presence. What is the argument? First, Israel has allowed teams from settler communities in the West Bank to take part in its domestic league. As far as the United Nations are concerned, this is allowing teams that are in another football jurisdiction, because of course there is a Palestinian Football Association established in 1998 and a full member of FIFA, to play in Israel's league. This is completely against FIFA statutes. It is totally and utterly unambiguous. And supported by the UN's rapporteur on sport, Willy Lemke. This is breaking international law. This is breaking FIFA's statutes. If this were done by any other football federation anywhere in the world, they would have been out of FIFA faster than you can say Gianni Infantino. There is absolutely no ambiguity on this, and Israel once again is given basically a free pass. Secondly, Israel has systematically undermined Palestinian football by refusing to allow Palestinian athletes, Palestinian footballs to move freely, equipment to move freely. It's become virtually impossible for Palestine to have home matches. They've been playing in Qatar for the most part for the last decade and other locations. Once again, if any other FIFA member or indeed UEFA member were doing this to another football federation, they would be out. Thirdly, the Israeli state has systematically intervened in the running and the operations of the Israeli Football Federation, providing enormous diplomatic support to them when there have been efforts by the Palestinian Football Federation and its allies to bring this issue actually to the FIFA Council to be voted on. Again, if this level of political interference had been occurring anywhere else, Israel would have been, that country would have been out. Israel remains. And finally, and I think perhaps the most important thing for today's conversation, there is a terrible record of racism inside Israeli football stadiums. I have personally witnessed it. I have stood in Beitar Jerusalem Stadium, where literally every single person around me is singing "We Hate Arabs." Or they sang to their Croatian goalkeeper, Kali, who had been on television responding to some rocket attacks on Israeli settlements by saying, back in Croatia, when this kind of thing happened, we knew how to deal with it. You've got to do this. And so you had an entire stadium chanting in Hebrew, and I loosely translate, Kali for Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force. This was just confined or primarily confined to Beitar Jerusalem in 2009, 2010 when I was last there. But we know from Football Against Racism and Extremism, FAR, that the level of racism being expressed in Israeli football stadiums is now much higher and has spread way beyond Beitar Jerusalem. I understand that they have recorded more than 70 incidents inside Maccabi Tel Aviv Stadium this season.
Mm.
This season. This is an extraordinary piece of information. I simply do not know how Justin Webb managed to go on Radio 4 and not put that point to the CEO
Yeah.
of Maccabi Tel Aviv. So just in conclusion, just to say, as ever, politics has been with us a long time in this field. It's not surprising. Racism has been around for a long time in Israeli football. It's got very much worse. But irrespective of all of that, the way in which Israel has operated with regard to settler clubs and with regard to the normal business of the Palestinian Football Federation are absolutely, to my mind, watertight legal case under FIFA statutes and indeed UEFA's for Israel's suspension from international football of all kinds. It should never have come to the situation that we're in today.
David, that was a remarkable introduction. Thank you so much. If only some of our media had included an iota of that background in the discussion over the last few weeks, we would be in a much healthier situation. Thank you so much. Going to move on now to Kevin Miles, who will bring a different perspective to the discussion. Kevin, here we go again, losing my notes. Kevin has worked in football as a supporter representative for over 30 years. He's chief executive of the Footballers Association in this country, wide experience of football policing, domestically and internationally, and has served as an expert trainer to the Pan-European Football Policing Training Programme run by the European Police College. He's a founder member and former chairman of the anti-racism education charity Show Racism a Great Red Card. I'm a great fan of that group. Kevin is currently an independent trustee of Kick It Out and was last year awarded an OBE for services to association football. Any other OBEs on the panel? I don't think so. Maybe that's to come. So, Kevin, you're going to talk. You're not going to address the boycott issue. You're going to talk about whether how racism can be tackled or should be tackled in the sport, and some remarks presumably about what happened with Maccabi. You've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to reinforce that little caveat, I'm appearing here because of my work position from the Football Supporters Association.
Yeah.
I do have quite strong personal views about a lot of the issues that's been raised. I thought David's introduction to that was excellent. The Football Supporters Association doesn't actually have a formal position on Israeli participation in world sport. I have my own personal, quite strong views about them, which are irrelevant because in this context, they're just the views of a fat Geordie skinhead rather than the views of a Football Supporters Association. So I think we could probably all agree, though, that that's an issue which does need to be addressed. It's an issue for sports governing bodies and an issue for governments it's probably not an issue that should be resolved by the Aston Villa Safety Advisory Group or the West Midlands Police. And that's where our involvement as an organisation has started from the point of view of trying to extricate and separate out the two issues, because what we weren't really expecting this match to be was a decisive and once and for all decision making about Israeli participation, the participation of Israeli teams in sport. We go from the point of view of what the situation is at the moment, and then how football fans are treated in that particular context. Now, it's interesting. Part of the work that I've done with policing of football matches across Europe is based on the Saint-Denis Convention, which is a European Council of Europe convention about the treatment of football fans, to which the British government, the UK government, is a signatory, has accepted all of it. That was a convention that was adopted in 2016, which sets out basically the three pillars of security and safety, security, and service as the three pillars of football policing. And although it's been going since 2016, on the 6th of October this year, a new recommendation was made as part and adopted into that Saint-Denis Convention on the use of collective bans against away football supporters. And there was a very strong recommendation there which defines a banning order as a legal or statutory mechanism used by a judicial, administrative, or sports authority to restrict or prohibit an individual or a group of persons, irrespective of the individual behaviour, from travelling to a country, a city, and/or a sports venue. And the recommendation recalls all persons have the right to travel and attend football matches and other sports events while respecting the laws and regulations, and to be treated in a safe, secure, and welcoming manner, while acknowledging that bans have the potential to infringe human rights. It also calls on states to prioritise individual accountability over collective restrictions and to apply collective bans only in exceptional circumstances where such a measure is necessary to maintain public order and safety. Now, our general position as the FSA and our European counterparts is that we do not support collective punishments and collective bans against fan groups. It is absolutely true that, as an objective fact, that the Maccabi Tel Aviv fan base contains within it an extremely unpleasant, violent, racist, fascist faction. And we have seen, despite the misreporting of what happened in Amsterdam last year, it's shone through that what was initially reported as an anti-Jewish pogrom by the population was actually instigated by organised far-right thugs from Tel Aviv Maccabi attacking the local population. And that is clearly a challenge for the police, and it's not anything that anybody wants to see. However, Tel Aviv Maccabi are not the only club in Europe with a horrible element to their support of the racist far-right participation. You could say the same against PSG from Paris. Nobody has ever suggested banning all fans from PSG. Well, I say nobody, I'll come back to that in a moment, because there are countries in Europe who reach very readily for bans on all away fans as a measure of it. But our position as a supporters organisation is that all fans have rights, and collective punishment punishes the innocent alongside the guilty. Now, sometimes that can be just regarded as collateral damage, but I'd argue that there's an extra element in that. If you were trying to undermine and marginalise the racist and fascist elements among the fan base, then the worst thing you can do is a collective punishment which treats everybody in the fan base as if they were a fascist or a racist. Because what that does, rather than marginalize the extremists that you're trying to oppose, it creates inadvertently a solidarity effect with the majority of fans, that the enemy becomes not the unpleasant element in your own fan base, of which there are campaigns at all of these clubs to try and do something about, there's a separate discussion about how effective any of the Israeli-based campaigns have been, and I think many of them have been silenced over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, and have been, they've been operating in extremely difficult circumstances in the course of the last 2 or 3 years. But the danger with a collective ban is it pushes everybody into the same camp. It creates a victim status for those who are banned. It creates a solidarity effect, and therefore our input into this discussion around the Aston Villa was we felt it was a misstep by the Aston Villa, the Safety Advisory Group, and the West Midlands Police to reach for that particular ban, because particularly in the context that this is taking place, there was a risk, and it has been seized upon and manipulated this way. There was a risk of that being perceived as an anti-Semitic ban. I'm not saying it was an anti-Semitic ban, but there was definitely a risk of that perception, especially when Maccabi Tel Aviv, the football club, revealed that the big majority of the application for tickets that they had were not for people traveling from Israel, but they were from the Maccabi UK group, particularly of supporters based in London. And that did look as well as danger. It was not a measure targeted against hooligans and against racists, but it was targeted against a whole block of football fans. I think that's problematic. We met with government officials. Yeah, we met with government officials to make this particular point. It's not a great look for a city that wants to be a host city at the European Championship in 2 or 3 years' time to think that they cannot police a football match properly. It should be entirely within the ability of any police force to be able to guarantee a football match taking place safely, and to defend the right to protest of local communities, the right to defend themselves of local communities against any external threat. West Midlands Police have formed for this. The only other recent ban that's taken place was a reduction in the ticket allocation for Legia Warsaw's game at Villa Park. It's the only police force that reaches for this. The UK has a very good record in terms of football policing, and internationally we stand quite proudly, in contrast to governments like in Italy and France, where local mayors reach very readily for bans on all away fans. We do think it's important that the rights of the majority of fans are upheld, partly as a contributory part of the process of combating the racism and the discrimination and the fascism, effectively, among sections of the supporter base at all of these clubs.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that's a perspective that most of us have not heard articulated in that way. Thank you very much indeed for that. And I think it's very appropriate that we move on now to Salma. Salma Yaqub is a psychotherapist and a former elected Birmingham city councillor. She's a patron of the Stop the War Coalition, and she didn't tell me this in her bio, but I know she's a very eminent and respected figure in Birmingham community. So, and I know she's got very well thought out views about this whole question. So, Salma, please go ahead for your 3 or 4 minutes.
I absolutely respect what Kevin is saying in terms of a principle that I personally don't like blanket bans or any kind of banning of freedom of speech. I think the way that we persuade people, the way we are shaped, whether it's our own views or other people, is to engage. And that would be my starting point. But when we know that there are real dangers, we're not talking about people being manipulated to silence each other, then we have to take that seriously. The Maccabi fans have a very specific record of causing risk to life, risk to people's safety. And in Amsterdam, where they played recently, they've actually been banned as a whole team because there were hundreds and hundreds of them rampaging through the streets looking for Muslims in particular to attack. And it was on that basis, on a genuine safety basis, that the SAG, the Safety Advisory Group, and the West Midlands Police took the decision to say a ban would be recommended. Let's not forget that Aston Villa Stadium is right at the heart of a very dense residential neighbourhood. And given our demographics in our city as well with young people, there's a real danger, number one, that they would be, that ordinary residents would be attacked. And number two, that people then would hit back. And that would cause another safety issue. So it would have been absolutely irresponsible. It was not a hypothetical scenario. Literally, in the weeks running up to this match, we've had the serious violence incidents. And the irony, it would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic. It was actually the team's own leaders who decided that they would not accept the Villa tickets. It wasn't because they were banned by West Midlands Police, because we had all the political furor where we had Keir Starmer stepping in, we had Kenny Bennydock stepping in, we had Nigel Farage stepping in, even Ed Davey stepping in, absolutely condemning this ban. I'm going to come back to that. But it's because they kicked off in Israel, and within Israel they couldn't control their violence. And the idea that those same people then would be welcomed and facilitated on the streets of Birmingham, the risk that would entail to police officers' lives as well as to ordinary Birmingham residents, that would have been deeply, deeply irresponsible. So with every freedom, we have to balance that with safety. And I would absolutely, 99% of times, I'm the person advocating, let's have freedom, let's have engagement, let's have openness. I'm very, very uncomfortable with using any kind of banning, whether it's on a public platform for speech or whether it's physically having people engage with one another. So I think it was absolutely right. The way it's been politicised, though, has been awful. And it's been Birmingham's Muslims actually have been the most vilified. Because when it came to the state, and I mentioned Keir Starmer, within hours of West Midlands Police announcing their recommendation to ban based on intelligence, we start to have this idea that it was Birmingham Muslims who were somehow insisting that Jewish people were not welcome. An absolute vile smear. And this is where the politics does come in, because it's not a new smear. As part of Israel's campaign, as part of Israel's justification for its war crimes, which are well documented by the United Nations and lots of other respected bodies, the idea that Muslims are somehow inherently violent, aggressive, anti-Semitic is used as a justification for the demonization of Palestinians. So there is a direct political line here that was being made then to Birmingham Muslims as somehow being uniquely anti-Semitic and contributing to a climate of fear or lack of safety for our Jewish brothers and sisters. When we are a city which we live side by side, we have genuine harmony. My own youngest brother went to our local Jewish school here. So this inflammatory rhetoric, which we then get left with, thank God that there was a violent outbreak on Thursday. But I can tell you, I feel that some people were relishing the idea of it. Some people were welcoming it. Some people wanted to see that happen in order to justify further demonization of Muslims in this country, but also the justification of violence against Palestinians that's been carried out by Israel. So this is where it's become very dangerous. And it's even more dangerous because our mainstream politicians have absolutely repeated the lies, have fanned that flame, and we get left with it. And it's not the first time that as Muslims, we're literally the political football here. We've had Trojan horse controversy here, where Muslim parents were accused of being extremists, infiltrating schools because they became governors based on a fake letter, but it took years to expose that. We've had Project Champion, where we've had surveillance by police cameras, pretending that it was all about traffic control, when literally in hedges, in areas where there's large Muslim populations, we had listening devices, cameras being pointed into people's bedrooms, and the West Midlands Police apologised for that. So it's not the first time, but what we're seeing now is a very, very dangerous, fraught moment in our history in this country, because we've had huge far-right mobilisations. There is an absolute connection now. It's not accidental that Tommy Robinson, the EDL, the English Defence League, was actually started off as a Jewish Defence League. And the link between Zionism and the far right has now become more and more entrenched. The fact that Tommy Robinson went to Israel and was actually trying to call out people to come and descend on Birmingham, which have added another damage to the safety and risk issue, especially to Birmingham's Muslim communities, and was not condemned by the mainstream politicians. But I feel that this has been normalised now. And so we have to call this out. So that's on the safety issue. But there's also another really important principle here.
1 more minute, Salma, please.
South Africa was boycotted for its apartheid regime. It's not, and the idea that somehow Israel's been singled out uniquely, of course not. As I said, Amsterdam already has banned the Israeli football team. But in principle, we've seen that Russia is banned. Its teams, as well as its fans, are banned. FIFA, UEFA have taken those decisions. So it's actually exceptionalism to say, well, no, that same principle cannot be applied to Israel. So number one, we don't want as a city to be promoting apartheid and whitewashing, because that's part of what it's all about. Just as a Eurovision Song Contest, just as their normalization in football, sports and culture, it's about saying this is a normal state. When actually it's a genocidal state, and we shouldn't be afraid and silence in calling that out. But secondly, it so happens that uniquely that Maccabi team also have these violent records. On both those counts, it was absolutely right to call it out. And I'm really proud of Birmingham citizens who turned out and said, not in our name. We welcome everybody, our Jewish brothers and sisters, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, people of faith, no faith. Samosas were being given out, tea was being given out. This was a festival that we wanted to make sure that our unity was on display. But at the same time, to say, no, that doesn't mean that we look the other way when a state which is carrying out genocide is then welcomed and given the red carpet in our city.
Salma, that was a brilliant summation of the issues, the way they played out in your community and broader ramifications as well. Thank you so much for that. We're going to move on now to Nick McGeehan, Nicholas. Nick is a founding director, co-director, of Fair Square, based in France. Thank you for joining us from France. He's a leading advocate on migrant workers' rights and sport, and leads the organisation's work on sport governance. He was a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch for 5 years, where he conducted research and advocacy on a wide range of rights issues, including abuses linked to the Qatar 2022 World Cup. He's got a PhD in the international law on slavery, forced labour and human trafficking. So, Nick, please give us your contribution. Much looking forward to it.
Thanks, Naomi. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I guess I'd like to pick up on an issue that Kevin and David talked about. And it's the issue of the fact that this shouldn't have been a decision for the West Midlands Police or for Birmingham City Council. And I just want to go into a bit more detail as to why that's the case. And I think the starting point for examining that, it makes sense to look at what happened in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam in November last year, there were very serious problems with racism and violence. And what they underscored, I think, was a structural problem within the Israeli Football Association to tackle systematic racism. Now, why is that an issue? Well, it's an issue because in UEFA statutes, in Article 7, there is a very strong and clear requirement on member associations to have a strict policy in place to stamp out racism. Now, this makes a lot of sense if we see football as a potential force for social good. We need to get rid of these nefarious actors within the game. Now, the behaviour in Amsterdam suggested serious problems. There's no real need to go over it again, but we saw racist, provocative, thuggish behaviour from the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans, which led to all sorts of violence. I think it is important to point out to the fact that a lot of that violence that Maccabi fans were then subjected to did have an anti-Semitic character. There's absolutely no question about that, and that was revolting. But it was the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans who started it. Now, David talked very interestingly about Beitar and Beitar's long history of very serious racism. Beitar was always the club within Israel which had very close links to the far right, very close links to Netanyahu and the Likud government, and were seen as by far the most problematic club in Israel when it comes to systematic racism. The fact that you have Maccabi now coming onto a major European city and causing this level of unrest suggested serious problems within Israeli football that were extending beyond Beitar Jerusalem into other fan bases and worsening. There's a very interesting report which we managed to get our hands on a couple of weeks ago. And it was a report by an organization called Kick It Out Israel. Now, Kick It Out Israel have been going into Israeli stadiums for the last 3 years at a minimum and documenting instances of racist abuse. David mentioned the increase in racist incidents in Maccabi among the Maccabi Tel Aviv supporter base, and that is borne out by the report. The report talked about a 64% increase in racist incidents in the last season. It said that the racism incidents are now documented in 13 out of the 14 clubs within the Israeli division. And it said that the most significant increase was among Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. It also noted in the report that Maccabi Tel Aviv were never sanctioned by the Israeli Football Association for what happened in Amsterdam last November. Now, that's a serious problem. It was right of the Dutch police to prosecute those instances of anti-Semitism, and they did so. They went out, they arrested people, and they did their job. The Israeli Football Association did not do its job, nor did UEFA. UEFA said that it would investigate the violence in Amsterdam and apply the appropriate statutory sanctions. There is absolutely no sign that it has done that. It's completely dropped the ball where this is concerned. So there is a very clear basis within the UEFA statutes for Israeli teams to be sanctioned. And obviously, Israeli teams being kicked out of competition, has the knock-on effect that supporters don't travel. But the target is really the Football Association as a whole. As David said, I think there are further grounds for a ban on the Israeli Football Association. As David said, the FIFA statutes, could not be clearer on the fact that you are not allowed to play football matches in the territory of another member association. Israel has been doing that for a very long time. The Palestinian Football Association has been complaining about that since 2013. They submitted another complaint to FIFA in March 2024, and FIFA to date has done absolutely nothing and continues to talk about issues like whether or not the settlements are illegal in international law, a fact which has been entirely settled by the International Court of Justice, among other highly, highly credible bodies. So the idea that Israel should be out of competition the statutory basis is very clear in the UEFA statutes and the FIFA statutes, and the Amsterdam violence demonstrated that. I think it's also interesting to look at the fact that, when bans have been imposed on foreign fans, it's typically been UEFA who's done it. And there's a very good reason for that, because it makes it a decision taken by the football authorities and prevents our police authorities getting drawn into the political controversy that we saw surrounding this match. So Red Star Belgrade fans and Eintracht Frankfurt fans were both banned from travelling to London in 2019. Kevin mentioned the Legia Warsaw ban, which happened after violence in Birmingham at an Aston Villa game. These are things that UEFA does. They basically say, to ensure that we don't have these problems, these supporters will not be allowed to travel. I think Kevin raised a really interesting point, and one that we really have to engage with. This idea of police overreach, this idea of allowing the police to become too involved in football is a problem, right? Because it's not something that we necessarily want. But I don't think we should be seeing this as a policing issue. And I think the controversy that has been allowed to grow has because of the abdication of responsibility of the footballing authorities. The point about this is, and the reason that UEFA has the statute, and the reason that we have organizations like Kick Racism Out of Football, the reason we have anti-racism campaigners around football is because football as a sort of cultural and social phenomenon can be an incredible force for social good, but it can also be an incredible force for real harm. That's why we have these policies to kick these things out. And when I think what you see in the case of Israel is you see endemic racism, you see systematic racism, you see increasing racism and violence, and you see the member association not doing anything at all to stamp that out. And you place that in a political context where football is incredibly political, and you have teams like Beitar Jerusalem with links to Netanyahu, links to the Likud party. And when you see a man like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is in control of the Israeli police, which has a terrible record of cracking down on left-wing supporters like Maccabi Tel Aviv, when you consider that political context, I think it is imperative that UEFA step in. And I don't think we can also step away from the fact that this is taking place in the context of a genocide, in context of the mass slaughter of Palestinians. Racism and the dehumanization of Palestinians is at the heart of that. So these things cannot and should not be linked. So the moral imperative for us to act on this is, of course, Gaza and what is happening there. But I think when we look to how do we enforce a ban, you have to go back to the statutes, and the statutes, I think, are very clear and argue strongly in favour of a ban.
Thank you, Nick. Yet another brilliant perspective. I'm so proud to have met you guys because most of you I didn't know before, and I'm learning such a lot. Thank you very much. We've got three more speakers. So the next is going to be David who's a Birmingham City supporter. Then we're going to hear from Naeem Malik, who's chair of the West Midlands Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We've got Mark Perryman, co-founder of Philosophy Football, who'll give us his thoughts on this, and then we'll round up with a message that I'm going to read out from Zara Sultana, and then if people are able to stay on for a little bit longer, we could have an open discussion about issues that have been raised. So David, he's a socialist. A long-standing member of Unison, the public service union. He's employed by Birmingham City Council, but wants to make clear that he doesn't represent them in any way at this gathering. He says he supported Birmingham City since he was a child, despite being born in Aston. So some of you may want to fight him over that. Been a season ticket holder for decades and supports the work of Blues for All, a group dedicated to ensuring football is an inclusive space for all the communities of Birmingham. So over to you, David, 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, I could be even quicker than that because I don't repeat the things that people have already said. And although I have a general agreement with what Kevin said about not collectively punishing football fans, when it comes to freedom of speech, which I'm a strong champion of, I do make an exception for providing a platform for fascism. And I suppose the issue is should we have a general rule, but then make exceptions in extreme circumstances? And I think what's happening in the world at the moment around Gaza, what's happening in Israel around the rise of the right and the record of Maccabi, I think is a good argument for making an exception. I think if there's a couple of people on from Birmingham, but perhaps people I might use some of my time just to say what actually happened on the night so people get a flavour, because I think the press lost interest because there wasn't a mass riot, there were no deaths or things like that. In fact, the counter protest was well supported. There was about 1,500 people at the counter protest. There were no anti-Jewish slogans, no anti-Jewish placards, no anti-Villa sentiment. There was no anti-police sentiment. In fact, most of the speakers showed respect to the police, and most of the crowd showed respect to the police. And although there were reportedly 10 arrests, I didn't see a single arrest, and some of these arrests were for things like refusing to remove a face covering, etc. On the other side of the fence, which you did get a glimpse of, there was a very small demonstration of about 50 individuals who had a couple of Israeli flags and had some pre-printed banners and placards that called for anti-Semitism out of football. I've had a look at the organisation that produced it. It was an organisation called Our Fight for Israel Against Anti-Semitism, which was set up after October 2023. I don't know much about that organisation. Like I say, I don't know if he's particularly active, but was active around this football match in putting out pro Maccabi publicity. Shortly before kick-off, as the late entrance from the pubs to the ground came, there were a small but significant and loud group chanting Tommy Robinson's name. Now, I don't want to. I've got a friend who's a steward who thought that was just like football banter, that people just. I think it's more significant and an issue for us football fans that things that happen in the wider society are reflected in football and reflected on the terraces, which is why I'm a strong supporter of Blues for All. We do lots of good work in taking asylum seekers down matches, groups from Gurdwaras and mosques to matches, both the men's and women's game, and generally promoted a more inclusive view of football. And I think if one of the things can flow from this discussion is we've got a lot of work to do, because I know that Kick It Out work with the Premier League to run anti-Semitism training courses against anti-Semitism at every Premier League club, and I know that it also has a good line on promoting a definition of Islamophobia and tackling it. But I think that is a big issue. If you look at the two main clubs in Birmingham, both of them are in residential areas, both in predominantly Muslim residential areas, but the participation rate of fans from those backgrounds in those clubs is relatively low, not non-existent, but relatively low. And so I think we've got a job to do in football amongst supporters in promoting that all-inclusive attitude. I don't think I've got much more. Oh, the other thing is I wanted to mention there was a real climate of tension built up around this match with 700 police from 20 different police forces. And I know lots of employers in Birmingham. So Birmingham City Council told its employees, if you don't have to come into work in the city centre today, you don't. You had the University of Birmingham City and Aston University, who've got campuses in the city centre, cancelling all lectures after 12 o'clock. And really, there's an attempt to really inflame the situation, which thankfully on the day did not materialise. And I think that the protest was in good order, was passionate, but didn't overstep the mark.
David, thank you very much. A really eloquent and well-expressed local perspective to add to Salma's. Thank you. Before we move on to Naeem, who will also be able to tell us about what's been going on in the Birmingham area, I want to pick up a couple of points that have been put into the chat. So Zahid has said that it's disappointing to see so little representation of young people on this webinar. Can't really argue with that. They're saying one of the most effective organisations on the ground, which mobilised outside Villa Park during the England versus Andorra game and the Villa versus Bologna game, I'm afraid I don't know about those, but somebody else will, were Youth Front for Palestine. And we're asked, did we attempt to invite anyone younger than 50 to contribute? It shows a lack of outreach on my part primarily because I was the one mobilising people. But I blame the people in the area who didn't put me in touch with you, Youth Front for Palestine. I'm sorry about that. There's been some comeback also in the Q&A about Kevin's argument, as we kind of anticipated there would be, saying Ash says we don't care about the rights of proven racist, violent Maccabi Tel Aviv hooligans. And they stopped their own fans travelling to Birmingham because of their known regular violent disorder. And that's a perspective from our audience. Thank you for engaging. So I'm going to move now to Naeem, who is chair of West Midlands Palestine Solidarity Campaign, has been active in the anti-racist, anti-colonial and trade union movement for many decades. And I'm sure he'll be able to tell us about the campaign that you waged when you learned that Maccabi Tel Aviv was coming to Birmingham and how that played out in the community. Do unmute yourself, Naeem. You've got 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I think the protest outside the Villa game was supported by the National Coalition that has been organizing demonstrations in London for over 2 years, and there have been over 32 demonstrations already. So that's the context from which this was happening. Although the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans have exhibited extreme racism with their chants of death to Arabs, and there are no schools in Gaza because there are no children in Gaza. Our campaign was about showing Israel the red card, which is in a way a different issue, and it also addresses what Kevin raises. And I think not because of the support base that the team has, but because it's in violation of international law, it's in violation of the charters of the FIFA and UEFA. My question to Kevin is, why should Israel be singularly separated from that? Why should Israel not have to abide by international law and by the charter? Because I think the reason why we are arguing that Israel should actually be suspended from FIFA and UEFA is because of its violations of their charters, is because they have got teams that are actually playing in occupied lands, in settlements. They are based there, so they need to remove those. And I think any federation that actually violates the charter would be suspended, as the Russian Federation was. So why should we make an special case in the case of Israel? And I think that's the point we wanted to make. And I think all this issue about uh, their their fan base is actually clouding the real issue, which is Israel should not be in the tournament whatsoever in any sport because of its violation of international law. I think the purpose for sports is to bring people together. The violence we've seen in Palestine, in Gaza, the genocide, is not bringing people together. We got to also keep in mind that many of the players who were playing for Maccabi would actually have either served or would go and serve in the IDF. They may have been from time to time being in Gaza, and they may already have been in Gaza during the genocide that is taking place there. So I think that's the context in which we were protesting. We were protesting against a team being allowed to play in Birmingham that is actually violating human rights, violating international law, violating the charters of the FIFA and UEFA. So I think that's the context of it. Uh, so, uh, so the fact was that Maccabi Tel Aviv is going to be playing in our city against all the international norms, as I've explained already. Most of the team members, as I said, would have served in the IDF. So I think there were many challenges on the way as we organized for this protest. And I think I will probably go through some of those. The national coalition and its local counterparts were adamant that as long as an Israeli team is playing in our city, we have to register our protest against the team trying to normalize Israel's violation of international law. When it was announced that Maccabi Tel Aviv will be playing in Aston in the Villa ground, there was expectation that UEFA and FIFA would suspend Israeli Football Association from their organizations. We had already started talking to inner city communities, particularly those living in the vicinity of the ground. They were apprehensive about Maccabi's team and the fans coming to our city and creating havoc and with racist chants. They also wanted to express their opposition to the match going ahead while a genocide is being committed in Gaza. Over the last 2 years, these communities have demonstrated against the genocide and Israel war crimes on a regular basis. Many have gone to London on a regular basis as well. Then the Safety Advisory Group proposed on the intelligence from the West Midlands Police that the match be played without the Maccabi fan present because of the havoc and violence and racism they exhibited in Amsterdam, and for which they were actually banned from Amsterdam as well. So I think it's not only Birmingham that's saying that fans are not welcome, it is also Amsterdam as well. When that happened, the Prime Minister, and including our Home Secretary, representing the adjacent constituency to the Aston football ground, demanded that the ban be taken back. I think the West Midland Police and the SAG group remained adamant that the ban stays. And I think that they were vindicated because just a few days later, Tel Aviv itself banned or stopped the match, the derby match from going ahead in Tel Aviv. So I think we could not, accuse them of being anti-Semitic in any way. Although I think we welcomed the SAG advice because it actually protected our communities, because if they had been shouting death to Arabs, that would not have been very welcome in our communities, particularly in the area where Aston is, because just next door to the Villa grounds, there's a large section of Arabs living as well as other Muslim and many other communities. So I think it would not have, created an atmosphere where, which is what should be. So I think a team that is complicit in genocide cannot be allowed to play in our city was very clear. We continued organizing and mobilizing in the communities around the ground. We met in mosques. I think we organized events in community centers about why and how we are protesting. I think we distributed over 20,000 flyers in the last 10 days. Posters were put in community centers, mosques, and local shops. The support we received was enormous. There was apprehension, even among the organizers and among certain quarters, that given the history of the area over several decades, And I think we've been involved in many campaigns in there in trying to protect the communities, in trying to, and people are probably aware of what's been happening in Aston, but it's not just in Aston, it's in Handsworth, in Lozells, in areas surrounding it, Ellenbrook. So over 20, so I think, so there was a good national mobilization as well, and I think that added to the spirit of the evening. Finally, I would like to say that there was a huge pressure on us to cancel the protest, as some feared it could end in violence following the SAG advice. What we are hearing was that the communities understand why we have to protest, and they will be there to ensure a suitable message will be delivered. And it was. The press covered the protest, and I think probably I have seen the widest press coverage in Birmingham ever for any of our demonstrations. I think on the evening itself, there were over 16 interviews being made, and most of them were actually seen on our national media and on local media. And I think relatively speaking, they were all very positive. I know the protest was noisy, but it was effective, and about with just 11 arrests, and none of them for anything violent. No violent incidents happened. Nobody was injured. So I think if we had capitulated and cancelled the protest, it would have been a very negative impact on the movement to stop Israel, to show Israel the red card. Now I think we are in a strong position to continue our campaign to show Israel the red card in any sport. I think if we had cancelled the protest, that would have been a very wrong message going from Birmingham, second city in UK. So let's us move forward and organize bigger and better protests every time Israeli sport team is playing in Britain.
That was just what we needed, Naim. Thank you very much. You filled us in there on the local perspective. And as you said, we are most of us here are part of a global campaign to show Israel the red card indeed. Just so it might be worth, I did take a note of what the police had said about the arrests, and I've kept it for reference, so it's probably worth pointing out. They confirmed that actually it was a total of 10 arrests. Initially, people did say 11 for a variety of offences. They said including racially aggravated abuse towards both pro-Israel and pro-Palestine groups. There were only 5 left in custody on Friday morning. Somebody trying to throw a firework into the ground. 2 people accused of racially aggravated public order offences, shouting abuse at pro-Israel demonstrators, 2 cautioned, 2 released with no further action, and 1 man charged with failing to remove a face covering. So that was, and they did, of course, as David Hughes pointed out, launch a huge police operation with over 700 officers and overkill in terms of basically shutting down schools, colleges, local authorities. It was a major operation. So hopefully we will now be able to proceed with respectable campaigns on behalf of the Palestinian people. I'm going to shut up now and hand over to Mark Perriman, co-founder of Philosophy Football. I know you've done other things in your life, Mark, but that's all he gave me for his biog. And a couple of minutes from you, please, and then I'll read our message from Zara.
Okay, I want to bring Keir Starmer into the conversation. Keir ignited this issue when he spoke in the House of Commons to suggest that Maccabi Tel Aviv fans are being singled out because they're Israeli and being singled out because they were Jewish. Keir wears his football on his sleeve. He parades in his England shirt every time England are in a tournament. Quite what that does for Labour's votes in Scotland and Wales, goodness only knows, but that's what he does. He's an Arsenal season ticket holder. He's in his late 50s. He still plays five-a-side football every weekend. So he knows his football. Yet he seemed to be unaware that bans, and I broadly agree with Kevin's position, by the way, that collective bans are not the way forward. Bans take place on away fans all the time. I, for a long time, was a travelling England fan, and Kevin will remember that we were banned from travelling to Turkey, effectively banned. The tickets were withdrawn. And there's a great deal of resentment about that. What you won't read in a single piece of reporting on this game or any game involving Israel is the catalogue that David read out in terms of a catalogue of reasons why Israel should be banned from international football. And what you will not read is why, and David will correct me if I'm wrong, because he's a much more expert on global football than I am. They are the only country in world football which don't play football in their own confederation. Why they were expelled, well, they were effectively expelled from their own confederation. And you will never, ever read a report. Why is a non-European nation taking part in European football competition? For all the reasons that David outlined, they should not be. But I think this hasn't been handled well in terms of the reaction to Maccabi Tel Aviv ban. And what I mean by that is that, in my view, English society, and I use English advisedly, is deeply anti-political. There is only one nation in European football which hasn't seen demonstrations in support of Palestine on the territories led by fans: England. Just about every other country across European football, you've seen demonstrations in support of Palestine. So the anti-political feature in English society and culture is reflected in football. If you're going to win an argument for fans to support Palestine, there is one tool and one tool only: football. When the man known as the Palestinian Pele, and you'll forgive me for the pronunciation, Suleiman al-Abeid, was killed by Israeli attack, as many other Palestinian footballers have been killed. Mohamed Salah responded to UEFA's sorrow that he'd lost his life with the brilliant three clauses. Why can you not say how he was killed, where he was killed, why he was killed? Mohamed Salah's tweet within 24 hours has attracted 1.6 million retweets. Palestine competes in international football under incredible difficulties, but it competes in international football. It's recognized by FIFA and the Asian Confederation as a nation. This is a key connection to make. When Israel hosted the Under-21 tournament in 2013, a very small t-shirt company by the name of Philosophy Football sent a film crew to Palestine to make a film about football in Palestine. Palestine, they're way short of qualifying for a World Cup, but they always qualify for the equivalent of the Euros. For the first time in the most recent Asian equivalent of the Euros, they got out of their group. They got out into the knockout stages. If you want to make a connection between Palestine solidarity and football fans, make it through football. Make the issue about Palestine through football and support the team. There's a fantastic website, Football Palestina, which reports on their games over and over again, and it gives you a real picture of all the difficulties they face, and yet the team competes in international football. Every fan, whatever the home team is, wants away fans to be there because it's part of football culture. I'm not saying the ban was necessarily wrong, but it didn't achieve the objective, which is to build, as I understand it from all the panelists here, solidarity of Palestine. If you want to build solidarity of Palestine, you build on the football terraces or in wider football culture, you do it through football. And the Palestinian national team is an absolute symbol of the nation that Palestine should be.
Thank you, Mark. You're getting a round of applause there from David. That was yet another really fascinating perspective. Thank you. What I'm going to do now, I'll read the statement that we've got from Zara Sultana, one of the very few political figures in this country to take a principled stand on this whole question of Israel's role in football, but also over the row generated by the ban on Maccabi fans. She can't be with us. I mean, we do also have Jeremy Corbyn, who's also been eminent in this, and Zach Polanski, and one or two others, too few, I'm afraid. I'm just going to have to pull up the message that I've received from Zara this morning, which is not there. Sorry, this might take a bit of fiddling. Let's get... Sorry, do bear with me. Yeah, here we go. So first of all, just to say, Zara, about herself, she is a Midlands girl. She's the independent MP for Coventry South and co-founder of Your Party. She was first elected in 2019, born in Losells, Birmingham in 1993, a stone's throw from Villa Park. A prominent left-wing voice, she campaigns on inequality, climate justice, and Palestine liberation. And she helped to found the new socialist movement in this year, 2025. She sends apologies for not being able to attend today, but has sent this statement to be read out in her stead. It goes like this. When I raised concerns about the Maccabi Tel Aviv match, it was never simply about football. It was about principle, about whether people in the UK are still free to oppose apartheid, to stand with Palestinians, and to call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions without being vilified. The local safety advisory group and West Midlands Police had judged the match to be high risk. Their advice was that allowing away supporters to attend could threaten public safety. Yet ministers ignored that advice and intervened for political reasons, insisting that restricting fans was wrong. That intervention wasn't about fairness. It was about politics, about shielding an apartheid genocidal state from criticism. Sorry, I've just gone and lost it. Where's it gone? Back up a bit. Right. Apartheid, Israeli militarism, and Maccabi Tel Aviv are inextricably linked. Many of these fans have served in the IDF, and rather than be welcomed into our stadiums, they should be arrested for war crimes. By overruling local authorities, the government sent a message that shielding apartheid mattered more than the safety of our communities. And while Gaza was still being bombed and starved, while hospitals, schools, and refugee camps were reduced to rubble, this Labour government chose to make a show of support for the Israeli state instead of standing with its victims. Let me be absolutely clear. Anti-Semitism is a vile form of racism and must always be opposed. But anti-Zionism, opposition to a political ideology that upholds occupation and apartheid, is not anti-Semitism. Criticising the Israeli government and demanding an end to its oppression of Palestinians is a moral duty. Yet, rather than engage with that truth, some in Parliament chose to distort it. They misrepresented what I and others said and tried to smear us for standing up for Palestinian rights. It was a shameful attempt to silence dissent, part of a wider campaign to make solidarity with Palestine unspeakable. Britain should not be arming or legitimising Israel's occupation. It should be supporting international law, demanding accountability for war crimes, and standing with those who fight for freedom and equality. Many ministers are complicit and should be held to account for their crimes. I have and always will stand with the Palestinian people. So I'm sure we'd like to thank Zara for that forthright statement. And now I wonder if we could, we have about 15 minutes or so left. I'd be very interested to hear if any members of the panel would like to come back on some of the comments that have been made. It's been a very rich discussion, so there's lots to talk about. Would anybody like to come in? I'll keep an eye on the Q&A while we're doing that. Anybody want to contribute? Yes, Naeem, go ahead. You need to unmute.
I just want to make this point forcefully. I think our discussion is about Israel playing football and why it should be actually excluded. And the reason for its exclusion is because of the crimes it's committing. Right? So we are not punishing them for nothing. We are not, it's not collective punishment either. Israeli Football Association is violating the charter, so it should be punished. Israel itself is violating, so it should be boycotted, and divestment should be the our answer to it. And I think that is the way that we have behaved in the past. I mean, South African apartheid was dismantled because of its isolation in sports and in in finances and everywhere, everything else. So I think the same thing should apply here. The other thing is we actually do quite a lot for Palestinian sports. We encourage children to come to this country and engage in sports. In fact, in Birmingham, one young person has actually started a Palestine football uh, federation. So he's actually training young people to play under the Palestinian flag. And hopefully there will be arrangements made so people or children from the West Bank or Gaza in the future maybe to come to Birmingham and play. So I think that's what it's about. It's not about just the fan. I mean, the fan issue is secondary to me in that sense.
Thanks, Naeem. That's very good. I see Mark's got his hand up. I just want to prime David Goldblatt and Kevin Miles. Maybe they'd like to pop back in at some point because you spoke much earlier and made very substantial contributions. But let's hear from Mark briefly.
Yeah, I think the problem is the argument didn't come across like that. It became an issue of preventing away fans attending a football match. I doubt if you will find very many, if any at all, Villa fans who didn't want those Maccabi fans to be in that stadium. If you make the argument about the catalogue of reasons why Israel should be banned from international football that David gave us earlier, you win the argument. You absolutely win the argument because it becomes about football, particularly about those Tetler teams in the West Bank, because then you open up an understanding about what's being done in the West Bank. That's what I mean. You make the argument through football, through football.
Yeah, nice one. David or Kevin, would you like to come back? And I'd quite like to hear your response to some of the other things that have been said. David? Oh, you need to unmute.
Yeah, I just want to support the point Mark was making that when you're engaging in the politics of football, you've got to be football led. Most folks in the end are going to football for the football and they really don't want to think about politics. And actually, fair enough, right? So if you are going to engage, you've got to engage on football-based arguments. And I think that was also true of the point Mark made about building support for the Palestinian national team and making a kind of narrative and engagement. I think that's a really powerful and important intervention and one that has been, missed, I would say. I mean, you do see this in other places. I mean, if you go to Celtic, of course, and Scottish football is a different culture, there's a whole different scene going on. And really, that's a model that we should be looking to. I also wanted to commend Kevin's arguments. I mean, I think the point that he makes about the problems of blanket bans and of providing a point of solidarity between racist ultras and then the wider Maccabi Tel Aviv fan base and beyond that is really important. And I also, while I noted in the comments that people don't care about the rights of fascists and racists, and I am sympathetic emotionally to that, I think it is politically a dangerous territory to get in. And I think we often, the use of the word apartheid takes us to the South African case. And what is interesting there in the sports politics of apartheid is that there was calls for the ban and for boycotting from within South Africa. And I think we miss an important point here. That's why that campaign was so incredibly successful and so difficult to undermine. And I think we need to be looking for allies within Israeli civil society. Of course, the majority perhaps today are racist and are ultra-nationalist, but we should be looking about ways of making connections with their opponents within Israeli civil society. And I think the more you create ways of driving the middle ground towards the ultra nationalists, which is one of the consequences of a blanket ban, undermines that element of the politics. And I don't think we should bear that in mind, that all these courses of action have their pros and cons.
Thanks, David. I definitely want to call Salma back in if she's got anything else to say, which I'm sure she does. But Kevin, you did say you might have to run off quite promptly. So if you want to contribute, please do.
Yes, please. I mean, it's just to reiterate that we've been in this sort of situation even with England before. It's going back, but Mark and I have worked in this area for a long time. And I go back far enough to 1985 with the England support in Dublin, getting a match abandoned there because of the racist violence by English fascists, etc. And it is by no means a position that we are defending the rights of proven racist, violent hooligans. We've supported, as an organisation, the introduction of banning orders, so that individuals who are convicted of those offences, guilty of those offences, can be removed from the game. We do not want racism and violence in the game. The question is that how you tackle that. And that's where I think that the idea of a collective punishment, a collective ban, actually undermines that battle. It's not just a question, it doesn't help. It actually undermines and makes it more difficult for that. The Football Supporters Association does a lot of work. I mean, we've funded Blues for All. We do a lot of work with Muslim groups, with Jewish groups, with groups from all underrepresented communities up and down the country to encourage their participation. David made some very good points about making sure that the demographics of a city is represented in the football ground, so that football is genuinely a shared space where for all members of our community, and that's something very much that we want to strive towards. Ash, in the comments, I hope I've answered your point about we're not here defending the rights of proven racist fans. A good police force should, however, be able to deal with a crowd and might make sure. I mean, we've experiences. I've been on the end of football policing for a long time. A good police force, and the British police force are generally have a very good record on this, should be able to manage a football crowd, contain, isolate anybody with evil intent, allow the right to protest, but allow the majority of people to watch the matches in safety. The argument was changed, I think, a little bit when the argument about the ban by the Aston Villa SAG and the Westminster Police disappeared when Maccabi Tel Aviv withdrew their application for tickets and said they didn't want any tickets. Ash, I think you give Maccabi Tel Aviv a little bit too much credit for this, actually, because in the club's statement they didn't say they were declining the tickets in order to protect the people of Birmingham from their fans. They actually, in their statement, said the well-being and safety of our fans is paramount. And from hard lessons learned, we've taken the decision to decline any allocation offered on behalf of away fans. In other words, they thought that the fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv needed protecting from the Birmingham population. Now, that for me is an outrageous implication. I think they pulled the plug on the public discourse, which I think is why it went quiet. I do think, in balancing if you have to balance the safety of local communities against a sporting event, then the safety of local communities is absolutely crucial. Absolutely crucial. But I think a good police force in football, the way it is in the UK, should be able to manage that, and manages it everywhere else, which is why it's such a glaring example of it's an exception to virtually every other rule about English football policing.
Thanks, Kevin. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. As I said, I would like Salma to have the opportunity to come back in. I thought I'd just pick up some little points from the Q&A, though. Several people reinforcing their support for isolating Israel in world sport. But this little note from Carol Vincent in East London, who talks about being part of the Clapton Community Football Club in East London. So these are the sort of places where presumably we can take this message of the positive role that football can play. She said that she played football at school in the 1960s, but the girls had to switch to hockey because the teacher left. That's a terrible shame, isn't it? I'll give Salma the final word, unless anybody else in the panel still has something they're desperate to say. No, I think not. That's excellent. Salma, would you like to come back as a
Well, first of all, thank you to all the panelists for their nuanced and really informed perspectives. There's lots of subtleties here, but I can tell you just as a local resident, people are really scared. The narrative was that Jewish people are not safe. And whilst the numbers of Muslims are not insignificant in Birmingham, I can tell you as a mom of boys, as somebody who lives in Birmingham, we viscerally felt the threat, both to our physical safety and to our reputation. Because especially when our so-called mainstream leaders waded in and accused us of being anti-Semitic, accused us of making Jewish people feel unsafe. We knew that was going to be something we were going to have to live with long after the match, whichever way it went. But also, there was no guarantee that we would not see violent riots, and it would have been our families, first and foremost, who would have been at that risk. But that was never publicly acknowledged. In this meeting, we've talked about, how the threat has been actually from the Maccabi fans. But out there in the mainstream discourse, that was pretty much lost. And it was quite deliberate, because actually the very opposite narrative was put out by our own Prime Minister. Even West Midlands Police was attacked, and West Midlands Police themselves didn't acknowledge that their risk assessment was about the Maccabi fans being the threat. And there was no acknowledgement about the vulnerability of Muslim communities. And that says a lot about where politics is at. It says a lot about the weaponization, sadly, of the use of the words anti-Semitism, because the promotion of this idea that we, as Muslims, are the threat to Jews, is a lie, but actually it makes Jewish people feel more fearful. It creates that situation. And at the same time, it's Muslim communities feeling vulnerable. So the politicization has been absolutely horrendous. And in those circumstances, to still come out and say, well, we're going to still make a moral stance that the genocide that's being carried out is absolutely wrong. And it does send a message when we legitimize Israeli football teams here to say, well, that's just a bit something that's happening over there. We don't need to look at that. We don't need to focus on that. So just to keep some focus on that was a deeply principled, brave and courageous thing to do, especially in the face of what we were facing. So I'm really proud of Brummies who came out and made that point. I don't think we could make, so many of the other subtle points that people here have talked about. That's a long-term thing about how football in itself and how Palestinian football, need to be supporting that, and how to engage, on a longer-term, ongoing basis with football fans themselves. But what was clear to me was that Tommy Robinson, when he made that call and said to the far right and his supporters to come down, it would have been about kicking off in Birmingham. So this is what really is about. So we can't lose sight of that. And that's an ongoing political framing. That's not just finished on Thursday. In fact, those people are really disappointed that there was not a kick-off. And that tells you something about where politics is at. So we're still at the foothills of this struggle, and unity, solidarity, the commonality between us as human beings is something that we really need to focus on, and not to forget and abandon the Palestinian people who have been subjected not just to moral and political outrage, but have literally been slaughtered in the hundreds and thousands.
Salma, thank you so much for that. I think we've done very well today. Somebody in the chat, Tony Greenstein's asking how many people in our audience. We only had a small audience, more than 40 people, which I was pleased with actually. But the point is that this is going to go on YouTube, and we can all send this around through social media and all our organizations, because this is a learning experience, I think, for everybody who watches it. Nice to see that Sam Sangeeta Maiska, the former LBC journalist, is one of those watching us today, and she's saying, surely Maccabi Tel Aviv should act to deal with its notorious hooligan element, and that's consistent with a point many people have made. I'm very pleased to have been able to host this today. Thank you to Mike Cushman for doing the backroom work, and thank you everybody for coming and taking part. Let's make use of the YouTube video as soon as available. We'll circulate links, and hopefully we'll have some positive effect on the way these issues are discussed and debated in future. Many thanks. I think we'll close. Bye-bye, everybody.